Do you remember the time Brian became a cop, but instead of being a good officer, he turned corrupt and started using a lot of happy powder? It all starts when Brian visits a therapist because he feels bored with his monotonous life. The therapist recommends helping others, saying it will push Brian out of his comfort zone. Brian agrees and begins his journey helping others. On his first day, he assists blind people who want to watch delicious movies by narrating the scenes in a very seductive way. However, Brian finds this awful and quits immediately. Next, he helps an elderly woman who seems kind and begs him to disconnect her life support because she's suffering and just wants to rest in peace. Feeling moved, Brian agrees, but just as he's about to do it, the woman suddenly freaks out, accuses Brian of doing something horrible, and calls the nurse. Brian panics and runs away, calling her a crazy old lady on his way out. The next day, Brian feels down because his attempts to help others have gone terribly wrong. He vents to Joe, who notices Brian's sharp sense of smell and suggests he join the airport police. Brian agrees and puts on the uniform. Surprisingly, he excels at the job, quickly identifying what passengers are carrying. He even figures out who Quagmire spent the night with, 2 Filipino women and a man. Quagmire denies it, saying it was 3 Filipino women, but Brian insists there was a man. Quagmire screams in shock when he realizes one of the women wasn't who he thought they were. Then Brian detects a stash of premium happy powder, and with Joe's help, they catch the man carrying it, who turns out to be guilty. After that, Brian makes several high-profile arrests, becoming such a hero that he's featured in a newspaper. Brian is so good at his job that he discovers a secret drug lab hidden inside an orphanage where everything was fake. The children were actually dwarves. The team successfully shuts it down, and Brian's status as a hero grows even more. However, things take a dark turn when Brian steals a small amount of the premium powder and develops a bad habit. He starts using it daily, becoming aggressive and problematic. This eventually leads to a fight with Joe, and Brian is kicked off the force. Without money or purpose, Brian spirals further, spending time with sketchy people and bringing unkempt women into the house. The next day, the family stages an intervention to help Brian. They offer words of encouragement, which almost bring Brian to tears. He agrees to go to rehab, but once there, he discovers Peter is also checked in, just for fun. Things go downhill when Peter convinces Brian to prank a camp for pregnant teens. The prank backfires, causing 16 premature births, which gets both Brian and Peter expelled from the rehab center. Surprisingly, this turns out to be a blessing in disguise, as Brian realizes he's already overcome his addiction. Back home, the family celebrates his recovery, and Joe apologizes for getting him involved in the job in the first place. Brian admits it was his own fault, and his choices caused harm to those he cares about. He decides to leave town and start fresh somewhere else. Brian calls a taxi, but before leaving, he says goodbye to Stewie. Stewie, upset, spits on him instead of saying goodbye, and that's how it ends.